All right, welcome everybody. My name's Cory Muhlbauer. I'm the agronomy lead in our R&D department. So my job is to work alongside of our engineer teams that are developing products. And the role that I play is as we work alongside each other with these projects and these ideas, I take it to the field, measure the value that we're creating, the increased yield or increase in crop performance or the lack thereof. Sometimes we might put something together as a prototype and we find out that we really aren't solving any problems and we have to do something different. The other aspect of being an agronomist in our R&D department is to be thinking about how we can interact with your guys' farming operations and make things better, looking for new things or just plain learning. The more we can learn, the better we can be, just like you guys. The more you learn about your business and how to grow crops and how to do what you do best, the better you're going to be. We've been focusing on fertilizer management for about the last 5-6 years. There's a lot of reasons for that we're going to go through today. But essentially, this session's kind of an open book about things that I've been learning, looking through. I don't have all the answers to yet, but I just want to share with you guys some of the stuff that we're discovering, and so you can hopefully take that home and make some different decisions on your farm as you strive to improve. So in the fertilizer world, something I like to do in general is always look back at history. So I did some internet searching, and the earliest commercialized fertilizer source I found for North America was bison skulls and bison bones. How in the world did this become a business for selling fertilizer back at that time? So actually, the way it's played out is prior to 1870, there was a global explosion in the demand for leather for clothing and that sort of thing. And so fur traders utilized the massive population of bison and buffalo in North America, and so they collected the hides from the bison. In fact, the original population of bison was 50 million estimated in North America, and they took the population all the way down to just an average of 300 was the estimate. So almost all the way to extinction. And the United States and Canada ever since then has been trying to rebuild that buffalo population to prevent that extinction. But all of that was driven off of the huge demand for the fur and the leather that they were able to sell that for. So fur traders, as they were collecting the bison hides, they weren't interested in the meat or the rest of the animal, so they left those lay in the prairie. And eventually somebody came along and collected the bones and learned that it makes their crops grow better, and that turned into a market for bison bone fertilizer. So I think it's kind of interesting. You look at that advertisement on the left-hand side of the screen. Even the marketing guys were pretty sharp back then. It's called Juan's Raw Bone Super Phosphate. Sounds like something I would buy today. So pretty interesting. Fast forward about 60 years, and another big event that occurred for commercialization of fertilizer and fertilizer manufacturing was after World War I ended, the United States had built 2 nitrate bomb plants for the war. And so when the war ended, those bomb plants were gifted to the Tennessee Valley Authority, and they converted those into fertilizer factories. So they started producing ammonia fertilizer and superphosphates. So actually, a pretty well-known commercialized phosphate source, triple superphosphate, was used for a very long time. It was the predecessor to the DAP and the MAP that we more commonly use today. Just 10 years later, we went through World War II, and when World War II ended, the United States built 10 nitrate bomb plants, and those were also converted to fertilizer factories, only they were producing anhydrous ammonia. So now you kind of have an idea of where these big events in history and how they ended up creating the fertilizer sources that we are dependent on today to raise the yields and the crops that we have. Fertilizer is such a big deal on the farms that it's actually the highest input for a corn producer in Illinois other than the cost of the land to produce an acre of corn. So this chart here is showing the 2019 estimated cost to produce corn. It's produced by Farm Docs at Illinois University. It's their economic department in ag. So we're spending about $135 an acre on our fertilizer programs, the highest input of all the other inputs in the system. So it's obviously something that we should care a lot about and that we want to make sure that we're being as efficient as possible with our fertilizer system. So it's also interesting, how have we gotten to where we are with how we measure and we manage our fertilizer management program? So soil testing is our primary system at place to do this, and so we'll take a look at the history of soil sampling because it kind of parallels the production of fertilizer over the years as well. In 1842, Liebig created the law of the minimum. Okay, and you've probably seen this a lot, but he's the first scientist who discovered that it's the single nutrient that's the most limited that's available to that plant that overall creates the yield that that plant produces. So it's not a collective total of nutrients or resources. It's actually the one single element that is the most limited that causes the limit to yield. So this directed the science world into focusing on individual inputs that the crop needs to figure out what we need to do to optimize the plant as opposed to everything as a collective whole. In 1920s in North America, some of the first scientists started working on soil sampling laboratory analysis. So Bray and Morgan and others developed some of the first lab tests that could measure the amount of nutrients in a sample of soil. And we still see today the Bray name and the Morgan names on some of our lab reports that we get back from soil sampling. You may have heard of a Bray P1 value or a Bray P2 value. Those are still used today on our soil sampling. So they started developing those all the way back in 1920. In the 40s and 50s, because of the increase in commercially available fertilizer from those factories that we talked about, there was an increase in the development and speed of correlating soil sampling to fertilizer applications as a potential for fertilizer management guidelines. So a lot of work was being done then. 60s, 70s, and 80s in the United States, the universities got involved and created the University Extension Education Services in Agriculture, and they started doing a lot of localized tests to figure out how to put to use soil sample values to guide farmers into how much fertilizer they need to optimize their crops. So they developed what we call the agronomy handbooks through these 3 decades, and essentially it's the system at place today. So they did a lot of really good work to make sure that we are strategic about how we're applying fertilizer and being the best at investing and getting an ROI on how much fertilizer we put in fields. And then in the 90s, essentially we took the agronomy handbook guidelines and we're able to apply GPS technology, and since the 90s we've now been in the variable rate technology area where we actually site-specific apply fertilizer based on individual soil samples instead of field averages. So fast forward to today, and that's essentially what we're running on. And what I want to do is just learn more about how efficient is that system and where can we continue to improve. So what's our next era of fertilizer management look like? So we're going to walk through how we measure, how we analyze and create recommendations, and then how we're applying those fertilizers. I'm just going to share with you the things that we've been learning. So how can we get better? And also, as the farmers, this is your most expensive input on the farm. And so I want to challenge you in thinking about how much are you involved, how well do you understand the system, and are you challenging the system to make sure that you're getting the best out of it that you can. First off, I think one thing that's important is basically your attitude or how you approach writing a check for fertilizer. Right? Are you resistant to spend money in a fertilizer program, and kind of what is your attitude towards that? I know a lot of farmers, that's one of their primary places that they like to cut inputs out of their farm, or they like to save money, and they may approach it like this guy sitting here on the couch. So watch this guy on the couch. I think his mannerisms and attitude is similar to about maybe half the farmers in the country.
Dad, got any spare cash? Thanks.
It's really not a bad strategy. I might use that with my teenagers at home. Probably not the best strategy to use when you're at the fertilizer retailer sitting across the desk from your agronomist there. You maybe want to actually have a discussion about why you're spending the money in your fertilizer program, right? Because it actually influences your yield and your profit. So let's walk through these three segments, and again, keep in mind on what your involvement in the program is. So how do we measure? Do we sample by grids or by zones? The soil sampling process is key. And then when? Should we do it every 4 years, every 2 years? Maybe we should be sampling every year. You know, the soil sample is our only way that we actually measure what we have. So potentially in the future, I think we might do it every year because then we can adjust every single year and fine tune it. I don't know. Who in this room, you guys in the simulcast, thank you for being there today. You can also raise your hands just so you're aware. Who in the room is sampling more often than 4 years? Raise them up nice and high. I want to get an idea what we've got. So in this room today, I've got about 5% of the room. Okay, so that impresses me, you guys that are doing that. You're already thinking forward on how you increase efficiency and better direct your fertilizer management system. So far at the conference, this is our third day, I would say we're averaging 10% of the audience is already soil sampling more often than every 4 years. So that could be one strategy to improve in the future. So what about the grids versus the zones? We set up a test to try to create a way to analyze accuracy. Hang on a second here. I had that switched off for some reason. So we wanted to set up a way to analyze the difference between grids and zones. So you understand how grid sampling works. Here's an example of grid points, the squares that would say represent a field, soil sampling process, and the values we get from the lab are then applied to each one of those points. And the way that we fill the whole map in, right, or fill in the whole field, that's called spatial interpolation. It's essentially averaging the values in between the points. So we interpolate what may have been in between the points to generate a full coverage map like you see here. So the highest value in the center where it's red, that 1, and all the way to 0 on the outer edges, and you can see how the colors adjust and change. So that's spatial interpolation. So spatial interpolation, it's a tongue twister, is a statistics-based concept. Okay, it's just a mathematic equation. There's actually no agronomic influence there. There's no soil science or agronomic influence to how we fill in the values between points. It's just an averaging formula. We're used to seeing spatial interpolated data. We see it all the time. When you watch the weather in the morning on TV, we always are shown a map of North America and the temperatures across the country so you get an idea what you're dealing with today and what might be coming from west to east. So essentially what this map is known weather station values scattered throughout different towns, and then they interpolate what those temperatures might be in between the weather stations, and they build a map. But you also know if you zoom in really close to your house or your town, the temperature may not be exactly right. It could be off by 5 degrees, 10 degrees, whatever. But zoomed out, we get a good picture of the variability across the country. We want to set up a test to measure what could be the most accurate way to represent a field, because ultimately our soil sampling process, the goal there should be to accurately represent what's really in the field. So we did a 1/4 acre grid sampling in a field just north of here. It's a 40-acre field just south of the town of Tremont. That's 155 samples in that field, and you can see the red dots there representing where those were pulled. So we're going to compare that to a 2.5 acre grid sample process. And we're using the exact same points and the exact same values, but we just removed all the points that wouldn't have been there in a 2.5 acre grid sample. And then we did it again on 5 acre grids, so we're down to just 9 samples now representing this 40-acre field. And then we also wanted to test the concept of smart zones. There we go. And so what smart zones are is, this is the method where you start to apply actual soil science and agronomy. So in smart zones, we go in the field and we separate where we sample by actual soil characteristics. So like soil zones, we put a border around it, and then we're going to do composite samples instead of point samples. And so we're going to collect cores through the zone. We're going to put all that in the same bucket, in the same bag, and whatever value that gets at the lab is going to be applied to that whole space, and there's no interpolation at all. So that value is applied to that whole zone, if you want to know the difference. So we did 16 zones to match the same sample count as the standard 2.5 acre grids. So just to give you a perspective on how far apart grid points are, in our 1/4 acre grid test, our points are still 104 feet apart. And if you think about how that impacts fertilizer, a floater truck spreads about 80 feet wide. So it's about 1 1/3 floater truck passes between sample points of known values. The standard 2.5 acre grids is 330 feet between points. So that's a football field plus the end zones in length. And there's about 4.1 passes with the floater truck in between measured values. 5 acre grids then are 467 feet apart, and that's almost 7 floater truck passes in between actual measured values in the field. So all the truck passes in between are just applying off of the interpolated average values. So what we did is we took the nutrients, we built the interpolated maps, just like you might see in your soil test booklets that you might get, and we're comparing them. We actually analyzed the data stacked on top of each other in our software program to come up with what percent of the field was accurately represented, because that's the goal in soil sampling. So compared to our 1/4 acre grids, we're looking at phosphorus, Bray P1 values here. Only 67% of the 5 acre grid is accurately represented in this case. And you just look at the colors on the map, they don't even look like the same field, right? So that interpolation on 5 acre grids is not doing a good job representing the field accurately. 72% of the field was accurately represented with 2.5 acre grids. Again, some really weird looking zones on those phosphorus map as compared to the 1/4 acre grid where we've got a lot more data to compare to. The smart zones then, based on phosphorus values, came in at 84% accurately represented in the soil test. So it's doing significantly better when we actually apply soil science and agronomy to how we're collecting the samples as opposed to just using the computer-generated points. The spatial map, when you look at the maps, they actually look very similar, 1/4 acre to smart zones. Now in this, we gave it a pretty luxurious bucket, okay? So we said anything within 15 part per million on the phosphorus value is going to be called good, and so we accounted for that. But 15 part per million is actually a pretty large range on a soil test, so we were pretty forgiving in this. So here's the other nutrients. The dark green bar on the left is phosphorus, the P1 value, then pH, and then potassium, the K value, and the tallest gray bar there. And from left to right, we're looking at 5 acre, 2.5 acre, and smart zones. And this is the percent area of the field that was accurately represented for each of these nutrients. And you can just see that all the nutrients get better as we move towards the smart zones on the far right. Now, potassium didn't change much, but that's because the potassium levels across this field wasn't that variable. So that's why those are close together. The interpolation actually worked in that case. So now let's flip that around. Let's say what area was misrepresented. So that 15 part per million range that we said we'll call good enough, it's a significant amount on the soil test. So anything outside of that range is a significantly misrepresented area of way too much fertilizer or way too low a fertilizer value. So 25% of the 5 acre grids was significantly misrepresented. The 2.5 acre grids had 20% of the field significantly misrepresented, and the smart zone still had 12%. So how does that apply to acres? So if you're a 1,000 acre farmer, you've got 250 acres of your farm that are significantly getting too much or too little fertilizer when it comes to this phosphorus comparison. And on the 2.5 acre grid, you got 200 acres that are significantly misrepresented, and we're still at 120 on the smart zone comparison as well, which that's not perfect in my book, but our goal is to, as accurately as possible, represent the field, and there is a big difference in how we collect the samples and apply the values. So I think we can get a lot better in the future, and as an industry, we should move towards that. Why is the smart zones, where we applied soil science and agronomy to how we sample, better? Okay, soil characteristics like sand and organic matter and clays and those sorts of things is exactly what makes up the nutrient holding capacity of a soil. And it's called CEC on a soil test, the cation exchange capacity. That's just a calculation in the lab of how many total nutrients are being stored. CEC is made up of organic matter and clay, and across the Midwest, 70% of the CEC value that you see on a soil test comes from the organic matter side, and about 30% of the CEC comes from the clay in the soil. So the organic matter and the clay is what drives the holding capacity in soils. Here's another example. This field is called Irish, and it's a 70-acre field up by Eureka. We pulled 148 samples in this field on half-acre grids, and I just charted the data to show you the correlation of organic matter to the CEC value, which represents nutrient holding capacity. So there's a very strong trend line of low to high organic matter representing low to high nutrient holding capacities in soils. So the organic matter characteristic of soils is a really good representative layer of nutrient holding capacity. On the left here, you're looking at a high-resolution organic matter map from SmartFirmer on the planter. A couple years ago, we created SmartFirmers to measure what's important in the soil as it comes to our crop. You'll hear throughout the day about its value in measuring moisture and residue and things that matter for seedling germination, but we also can generate an organic matter map. So it's as good as you can get on representing the organic matter variation in the field. Could we build zones from our prior grid sampling data that we already have is a question. So if you're sampling on 5-acre grids, the correlation of organic matter zones to the accurate map on the left is pretty poor. So you wouldn't be able to use 5-acre grids to build zones. The 2.5-acre grid organic matter map still barely looks like the same field, although it is starting to take shape a little bit, but we got a lot of weird curves and zones from that interpolated data. This is the 1/4-acre organic matter map. It's starting to align a little bit better, but even points 104 feet apart end up with some odd zones when it comes to the organic matter in this field. So we have some weird circles and shapes to this field as well. Plus, moving to 1/4-acre soil sampling, this cost us about $65 an acre to run this type of intensity of sampling. So it's probably not a viable source for the future. So organic matter can be mapped with SmartFirmer on the planter with your 2020, and essentially it does a great job of representing the soil characteristic variability in a field, and that can be applied to many things in your farming operation to help you better manage. So the SmartFirmer map is what we used on that 40-acre farm to just hand draw our zones. And what's neat about smart zones is everybody can have input on how you best represent the field. So if Grandpa tells you that 30 years ago there was a cattle feedlot in the corner, you make that a zone, because the history of how a field was farmed has a huge influence on the nutrient capacities that it has today. If you join two fields together, wherever that fence line used to be, that line should be drawn, and you sample differently on either side of it with respect to soil zones. If you've got yield maps that show you a spot in a field that year after year has lower yield, then you want to draw a zone around that as well and sample within that. So you can continue to increase the accuracy of representation in a smart zone system. So what about the laboratory analysis side? So the analyze aspect is another one of those three. So we wanted to look into how repeatable and accurate are lab values and the soil handling process, as well as what impact does the recommendation process have on your actual fertilizer use. So Wendy Streetmatter, new employee here, she went out this fall, and instead of taking a soil probe to the field, she took a shovel, and she collected about 10 gallons of soil from one spot in a field, and she put it in a tub and she mixed it up really well so that it was a well-blended, large sample. And then she took that soil and put it into individual soil sample bags. 160 soil samples total were created from this large blended sample. And over a 14-day period, she sent a handful of samples every couple of days to the lab. And we want to just look at the results and understand the variability in the data that comes back from the lab. So included in these results is the impact that the FedEx and the UPS truck might have, but also just the variability and accuracy of the lab testing procedure itself. So it's kind of all bundled into one because we don't have control over those portions of this process. So pH was really tight. pH only had about a 1.5% variation across all 160 samples. Phosphorus had plus minus a little over 10% variation, which is a total range of 20%. And then the potassium had 33.5% plus minus, which is a total of 67% variation. I've talked to a lot of people in the soil lab world. This isn't that uncommon. These numbers fall in place about right. Potassium is a really hard one to represent. So this is just a reality. I think as farmers, this being a driver of your number one input, I think you should just be aware of the variation. So if I put actual pounds of fertilizer up here, the phosphorus variability from the lab will swing your DAP program by about 40 pounds of DAP, and the potash program is going to swing by about 134 pounds of potash just based on the variability of lab results. So it's just something that you need to be aware of. This is not a precise process that's always exact, other than pH looks like it is, but it is accurate in just guiding us in a direction, and that's important to know how to manage it. So how do we turn that into a fertilizer recommendation? There's two parts to a very simple formula. There's the crop removal portion. It's basically the yields that you remove from the field, the grain you remove, the amount of nutrients in that, and then the soil build part of the portion. You just add together crop removal plus soil build fertilizer, and that's your fertilizer program rate. You guys have a huge involvement in this formula as a farmer. At least you should. So the primary multiplier in the crop removal half of this equation is the yield. Okay, so here's a couple of farmers having a chat about their fertilizer program. You guys might recognize these farmers. The farmer on the left says, "What yield goal do you use for your fertilizer rate?" Farmer on the right says, "I tell my fertilizer guy 200 bushels per acre. I don't want him to overcharge me." So it's back to that attitude like the guy in the video earlier, where if a lot of farmers actually tell their fertilizer guy a lower yield because they know they'll save a few bucks on fertilizer than if they tell them the actual yields or the higher yields that they're achieving on their farms. Probably not the best approach to optimize your fertilizer program. So also, what about variability within a field? So if you only use the average yield value for your fertilizer program, that would say be represented by a 200 bushel per acre yield goal in corn in the middle of this chart. Do the equation on that, you'd have 152 pounds of DAP for a recommendation. That costs about $36 an acre. But in most fields that I look at on yield maps and stuff, we probably have zones that are 150 bushels, and we probably have zones that are 250 bushels when we're achieving a 200 bushel average. So your 250 bushel zones are getting under fertilized by 40 pounds of DAP, and your 150 bushel zones are getting over fertilized by 40 pounds of DAP. And is that the right way to optimize our fertilizer program? I wonder, why aren't we all using our yield maps for the calculation of crop removal rates? Maybe that's something we should be doing. I'm just putting that out there as things to think about for the future. So then the build side, the soil build and maintenance side of the equation, this is where the agronomy handbooks from the university comes in. And so if you read an agronomy handbook, I think every farmer should, but I don't know too many that have. It's basically, they say right in the paragraphs in the book that these are guidelines because they're based on a number of trials across the state over multiple years, but it's not on your farm with the history that your farm has. So essentially, they put together some rough guidelines, and they collected data that says, here's the yield response from 0 to 100% on the left-hand side there, and then the soil test values across the bottom from very low to very high, and they're plots that were a lot of work and are very helpful to guide us. They say, okay, here's the optimum zone where yield is not limited by the nutrients in the soil any longer. So that's our target in the fertilizer industry to build the soils up to. Well, where you have input is you should probably know where your fertilizer retailer's goals are as far as your soil build levels. So if this was a phosphorus chart, the difference from the left-hand side of optimum to the right-hand side of optimum is about 10 part per million on the soil test. That 10 part per million in the fertilizer application equation is about 400 pounds of DAP difference. So if your fertilizer retailer is always building your soils to the high side of optimum, you're spending about an extra $100 to get it there and to keep it there, as opposed to if you chose the lower end of the optimum range. And both of those are still full yield potential based on the handbook. So this is just a reason why you should be involved. There could be $100 difference in fertilizer in your program. So there's a lot of wiggle room in this whole process, right? So the way I like to think of just overall how we measure and how we analyze our soil test values and turn it into our fertilizer recommendations, it's kind of like kids at the fair trying to guide their pigs across the pen and keep it right in front of the judge, right? They want to do a good job of that. But with today's system that we're using, grid soil sampling every 4 years, and your lack of involvement in the recommendation process, we're really just at this peewee level of showmanship. These kids are about 7 to 8 years old, and this, to me, represents how good a job we're doing guiding our fertilizer. So what we do is we whack it to the left for a while, right? That's what these kids are doing. They whack their pig to the left. Eventually that pig is almost going the wrong direction. They jump around the other side, whack it back to the right, and try to get it across that pin, but not on a very straight line, are they? So from what we've learned so far on the how we measure and analyze process is smart zones where we actually apply agronomics and soil science, and how we pull soil samples is a better system. Increasing soil sampling frequency, I don't have data on it, but it's likely to be a big improvement in how we continue to guide our system. And then lower soil test build targets, especially if you're banding some of your nutrients on your farm. And we'll talk more about that later, but do we really need to be always shooting for the agronomy handbook's high end of optimum soil test ranges? So if we start doing a better job, basically what we're talking about is we're increasing our focus and attention, and we can't change the pig, right? Our fertilizer management system is still a pig, but if we step it up a little bit and we increase our focus and we adjust more often, we can guide our pig across the pen like this senior class showmanship at the county fair. Notice the attention to detail and the focus on their faces as they move these pigs across the pen in front of the judges. This is where we need to go with our fertilizer management approach. So how we apply is a big factor as well. The application process, should we be banding more fertilizer, or is broadcast good enough? Fall or in-season applications, those are all things that you should be thinking through on how to best optimize the highest input on your crop. So first of all, the 30, 40-year-old agronomy handbook resources, they're very good, but they're all based on broadcasted P&K methods. Okay, and that method has the concept of we give the fertilizer to the soil and we build up this bank of nutrients in the soil, and then our plants can withdraw the nutrients they need all season long. The problem is this bank doesn't work as good as the ones that we keep our money in, where we can go to an ATM and get money out anytime we want. In fact, now on the phone with an app, you can transfer money any minute of the day just by pulling your phone out and moving money around. The soil bank is not that useful or forgiving. The soil bank is heavily dependent on that CEC process and how efficient it is. So there's high tie-up issues. It's very weather dependent. So it's not an efficient system. So should we be depending 100% on a soil bank to feed our crops? We've been doing work the last few years on banding nutrients with the planter. This is obviously one of many options that you could have. But we've been looking at the opportunities of phosphorus-based starters on the planter and nitrogen banded on the planter, and seeing how we can improve things. It's good to understand individual nutrients. Like Liebig's law, each individual nutrient plays an important role. When it comes to phosphorus, phosphorus is very commonly unavailable to plants early in the season. There's a lot of hidden hunger and yield loss early in the year, and that's because phosphorus is an immobile nutrient. It's a negative charge nutrient. The bulk of nutrients in the soil are positive charge, and just like opposite ends of magnets, they lock up together, and phosphorus is tied up most of the time. The root mass of early season crops is very small, so it's not tapped into very much soil volume yet, so it doesn't have a lot of access that way. Plus, soils need to be above 65 degrees before phosphorus really starts to become available. So these are all reasons why broadcasted soil bank nutrients are a struggle to get access to. FurrowJet we designed, and it's been out for about 5 years now. It places phosphorus in 3 locations right around the furrow, ideally positioned for optimum efficiency and uptake. It's a safe way to apply phosphorus on the planter. We like to split it 3 ways, and 1/3 of your overall rate goes in furrow for the seedling root uptake, which is important for early vigor, and then the remaining is positioned in the soil off to the side for the crown roots to take up. So if you had a 6 gallon per acre rate, just for easy math for myself, that'd be 2 gallons in furrow. The other 4 gallons are being soil applied off to the side. Done a lot of trials where we look at starter on the planter. In R&D, we studied it pretty heavily, 2015 through 18. Every time we do a trial, the banded starter versus the same amount of fertilizer in broadcasted form right next to it always has bigger, healthier, more uniform, better looking, more vigorously growing crops. This always equates to the potential of yield being higher. So just like improving your stand from a shoddy stand to a picket fence stand, the potential for yield is increased anytime we can improve plant health and nutrients as well. Doesn't mean it always fills out that potential by the end of the year, but we're always setting the stage for higher yield. So here's just a recent plot that Jason Webster did up at PTI, one of the many that he's done up there. This is using 1034-0 starter, and you can see it's a rate plot. So versus broadcast, at about that 10 gallon an acre range, we're achieving 5 to 5.5 bushel an acre yield response. In our R&D trials, over that 4-year period, we did a number of plots all over the state of Illinois. And it really portrays just the weather condition and how much of an impact it has on the response to starters. So in 2015, the first year we did it, it was very wet and cold. So we had 10 to 27 bushel responses to starter, very strong response year, all due to the lack of phosphorus availability that those plants were experiencing. 2016 was the opposite. We were warm early and we stayed warm and we had adequate rainfall all the way through. Not much variation between all of our plots, just 0 to 5 bushels in those plots that year. 2017 was widely variable across the state, so depending on the weather that each county experienced that we had plots in, we were anywhere from 0 response to 20 bushels with starter on the planter. 18 was very similar, a lot of variability depending on the plot location, so anywhere from 3 to 18 bushels is what we experienced in 2018. So this is all comparing about 8 gallon per acre of a polyphosphate starter to broadcasted programs. On average, I think this average value is pretty good with the diversity that we experienced through those 4 years on multiple trials. We're looking at a 10.3 bushel per acre average response to starter on the planter at 8 gallon per acre, and that's about a $30 an acre profit that we experience. Now, it's important to understand how to integrate starter into your overall fertilizer program. You want to make sure that you're meeting with your fertilizer agronomist to integrate it into the system. So we're going to walk through kind of a demonstration to help you visualize how you move fertilizer around to reallocate for starter in your program and what the difference is in the profit or ROI on these systems. So standard system, we're going to be all broadcast, and the height of these cylinders is representing the pounds of phosphorus nutrients in the program. There's actual DAP in the cylinder itself, but it's not pounds of fertilizer, it's pounds of nutrients. So this level right here is representative of a 225 bushel yield goal, the crop removal amount of fertilizer that we need to broadcast for that year. Now, This is the soil build portion. It's about another 30 pounds of phosphorus. So our soil test values were on the low end of the optimum range in the handbook, so our agronomist wants to build our soils up to the high end of the optimum range, so we need a little bit of build fertilizer in the program. So we've got our total program, which is the crop removal plus the soil build. We'll call this the status quo, so we'll compare to this program. This set of cylinders here then is, you've heard that starter adds yield on the farms, you've seen the data. So you're going to add starter into your system, but you didn't have that conversation with your fertilizer agronomist, so you're still going to do your standard broadcast program. You're not adjusting the rates of your broadcast program, so we got our crop removal plus our soil build in the broadcast, and then you went out, put tanks on your planter, and you're going to add starter. I made it. So you're essentially adding more fertilizer to your overall system, and that adds cost. That 8 gallons of starter there adds another 30 pounds of phosphorus, and that costs about $22 an acre if you're using a polyphosphate. We got the 10 bushel advantage, but we did add more cost, so we're at about a $13 an acre increase in profit compared to our standard broadcast system. So then this next program, we've got our grain removal rate of DAP, this much phosphorus, and we're adding starter, and we had the conversation with our fertilizer agronomist, and so what he did was he removed some of the DAP that we were going to apply, so we still have the same overall phosphorus goal to meet our crop removal plus soil build needs, same total phosphorus as the status quo program, but by shifting the fertilizer around, now adding in the starter really only costs $6 more than the 22 by adding it all on top of our original program.
So we still have the 10 bushel advantage.
We're just more cost efficient, and that's a $29 an acre increase in profit over the all broadcast program. This last program is taking it to another level of efficiency. Okay, so originally your agronomist wanted you to build your soil test values all the way to the high end of optimum, but you got involved and you realized, I'm banding some nutrients. I can probably be just as good at the low end of the optimum range in the handbook, so I don't need the soil build portion anymore. I'm going to run starter, and I'm going to run my total program right at the grain removal rate of that program. And so I saved the soil build portion of it, and now my ROI, my profit goes up to $46 an acre as compared to the original broadcast status quo program. So we're able to save some fertilizer by having a lower soil build target. We actually are increasing yield because we get a 10 bushel response from starter, and overall the profit is the highest. Okay. So we've also got conceal, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time with it. Jason Webster talked about it this morning, but it's a nitrogen position tool. So we think between conceal and FurrowJet, we've got it pretty well dialed in on optimum positions to place nitrogen and phosphorus in the springtime to overcome some of the inefficiencies of fertilizer availability. Just a quick look at one of Jason Webster's trials at PTI Farm, where he's looking at a status quo of broadcasting nitrogen with the sprayer and then side dressing the other half of the program. If you just take half of your weed and feed nitrogen, move it to the planter, we increase the yield in this case by 13 bushels per acre, and we haven't spent any more money on fertilizer. So in the nitrogen world, there's a huge opportunity as well to increase the efficiency. So the last part of our session, I'm going to show you some trials that we've been doing. And what the approach here is, what can we learn from pulling together the overall status quo program of P&K being all broadcasted and trying to build to high soil test target levels versus banding some of that product with starter and using lower soil test build targets and being more efficient overall. So we have 3 fields that we've been running for 3 years that we're going to walk through. So the first one is a 20-acre field where we've got multiple replications of fertilizer programs. It's a low fertility field. There actually hadn't been any fertilizer applied other than nitrogen on this farm for 25 years. The reason is the owners assumed 25 years ago that it was going to be sold for housing development, and they decided to cut back on all costs, ride it out, wait for it to be sold. You see the houses on the left-hand side there. Well, 25 years later, it still hadn't been sold, so it turned into a phenomenal opportunity for us to learn about fertilizer efficiency and programs. It is high productive ground. It's 3 to 4% organic matter. And we've been running this farm on corn because I'd like to get 4 years of corn yield data before we switch to corn soybeans. So we'll walk through this field as a low fertility example. The other thing that I want to point out is almost every farmer I know has soil sample values in some parts of their fields that are very low soil test values. So this is a good example to understand maybe a better way to manage those low fertilizer testing zones. Also, a lot of farmers pick up a new farm, and that new farm, when they get it soil tested, is pretty disappointing on soil test values as well, and is the right thing to do to attack it the way we have before, or is there a better strategy? So you can maybe pull a few things out of this plot to help you in those situations. We're running 3 programs here. We thought it'd be interesting to keep the nitrogen-only program going that the farmer did for 25 years. And then we're doing a banding program with a moderate soil build target level. And then we're doing an all-broadcast P&K program with a high soil build target level. So you notice the nitrogen rate's the same all the way across, 240 pounds of N per acre. The big difference here on this farm is how we're managing P&K. For lime, all 3 of these fields, we're liming the same because we're not studying lime. So we're trying to keep the pH the same for every program. To achieve 200 pounds of P2O5 and 240 pounds of K, those are the nutrient rates, that's 400 pounds of DAP and 400 pounds of potash. That's actually what the agronomy handbook calls for to do a 4-year soil build on this field. So here's the soil test values when we started, so you know what we're working with. The phosphorus P1 values are about 6 part per million, and in parentheses there on the left, that's the optimum range on average in an agronomy handbook. So the K values are 130. They aren't too far away from optimum, and then pH is in the 5.5, so there hadn't been any lime in this field either. We've been working these programs for 3 years now. We sample every year, and we adjust as needed. So in 2019, our nitrogen-only program still at just 8 part per million phosphorus and 140 on the K, and we have lime, so we brought the pH up to 6.2. So we're not doing any P and K management there. 2019 banded program block with the low soil build target. We're up to a 20 part per million on phosphorus, 170 on K, and you can see we've corrected pH. So I actually feel my target was 170 or so on the K. The P, I want to say just under 20, the low end of optimum, so we're kind of just right there. On the broadcast program, we're trying to get to 30 part per million, but we're still just at 24 on the phosphorus level, and we have gotten the K up to the high end of optimum there at 225. So we've moved the needle quite a bit in 3 years. Look at the dollars we've been spending. So the average per year cost of these fertilizer programs, we're spending $98 an acre on nitrogen, $186 an acre on the moderate build program, and $249 an acre on the high build program. So can we make up the difference? Can we profit from the extra $150 an acre with these P and K programs? Will it hold up as being a good decision? All season long, we can visually see the differences in these fields. Everywhere we banded nutrients versus broadcast, the banding is always a little bit bigger and significantly better in uniformity and color, again, setting the yield potential higher. Tasseling time is a phenomenal time to evaluate how good a job you're doing in your farm at feeding nutrients to your plants. What you want to see, phosphorus and nitrogen are driving forces to the maturity advancement of a corn crop day in and day out. So the timing at which the tassel comes out is the loud signal. It's a flag that says we're at the end of our season. We're going to focus all our energy on the ear. And so what you want to see is perfect uniformity of tassels when they come out. That would give you the opportunity to pat yourself in the back and say you did a good job. Look at the in-season banding block on the left, very uniform tasseling going on there. The nitrogen block in the middle where we have no P and K, it hasn't even tasseled yet. And then the high broadcast rates on the far right is very inconsistent. So we got 400 pounds of DAP and potash over there, and we don't have uniform tasseling. That tells us that we didn't uniformly feed those plants, so that's an issue. Why did 400 pounds of DAP and potash not adequately feed these plants? Does anybody know what happened to all that fertilizer? We didn't lose it. We didn't lose it. This is high CEC, good productive soil. It's all tied up. I heard somebody say it's tied up. So it didn't go down the tile line. P and K is not very leachable unless you get crazy high levels. We didn't get erosion. It's all tied up in that soil bank. So our soil bank is really fat and really happy, but it isn't allowing our plants to withdraw fertilizer when it needs it. Okay, so that's just a reality of the soil bank system and how soil releases nutrients. Here's our average yield, 172 bushels per acre on nitrogen only, 238 on the moderate build band program, and 235 on the high broadcast rate program. One thing to note is how valuable the P and K aspects are in your nutrient programs. I know too many farmers that when it comes to cutting costs, they cut their DAP and potash and keep the nitrogen going. And that's not a sustainable system. You have to respect soil test values and keeping those plants fed. These are all key nutrients. So there's a 60 bushel difference where we're not applying any P and K versus where we are. And we turned this around in just the first year even, and this is the 3-year average. Our profit per acre on average, we're making, after we pay for the fertilizer, making $500 on the N only block. We're making $647 on the band with a moderate soil build target, and we're making $574 on the broadcast high soil build target level. So far, our example of a low soil test level field, we're making $73 more per acre by an overall more optimized program. A combination of banding and lower rates of broadcast and the lower soil build target to be more realistic on the value of the soil test nutrient supplying power. So the next field is Irish. It's up by Eureka. We're using the 40-acre south half of this field for redoing the same programs, except we don't have nitrogen only on this farm. The farmer didn't want us to do that. So we have our banded versus our broadcast concepts here. This is high productive ground, 3 to 4% organic matter. We're doing corn-soybean rotation on this farm, and it starts out with good soil test fertility. So year 1, 2017, our soil test levels were 31 on the phosphorus, 130 on K, that's just a little low, and our pH wasn't too bad at 6.1 on average. Our banded low build program, we're actually going to walk that high phosphorus value down a little bit. We're not aggressively pulling it out of the soil, we're just going to walk it down. There's a savings opportunity on your farms if you've way overbuilt soils to utilize some of that over the next, I don't know how long this will take to bring it down, but we want to get it down to about 20 part per million. It might take a while. So we're utilizing that, and then we've brought the K levels up to a little over 200. So we'll just maintain that value going forward. You can see we've corrected the pH a little bit. We're up to 6.7 on average. So then the broadcast program, we're just trying to maintain that 30 part per million phosphorus value, and we brought the K up to the high end of optimum at 235. Here's what we're spending on average on this plot field, $151 an acre on the broadcast program, $119 an acre on the banding program. Here we're looking at, since it's corn soybean, we're looking at each individual year, the yield advantage of the banded program over the broadcast. So corn, we're at 5 bushels better than the broadcast, and then 3.4 in 2019. Soybeans were actually, the 1 year we had soybeans, about a bushel behind our banding program as compared to the broadcast. I'm not sure why that is, but it's just 1 year data, and it's a pretty small difference. So I'd say we're kind of just neutral or break even there. It could be, again, I'm just exposing what I'm learning as I go. We used the 2018 soybean year to not apply any fertilizer because the field already had high soil test values. And so that could be what we're seeing here. That 1 bushel difference might be that fact. So next year it'll be back into beans, and I intend to put a little bit of fertilizer on with the planter to band some. So on average, this field we're making $38 more per acre with this concept of a lower soil test build and banding nutrients. And so you can see also the yearly advantage in profit of the banding program over the broadcast program. So you can see since we use the soybean year to not apply fertilizer and pull our soil test values down just a hair, that's our highest profit year as well. So profitability is part of this. It's fertilizer savings plus the yield. Our last field is Terhune. Terhune is sandy field over by Manitou, Illinois. You can see we got quite a variety of field and fertilizer conditions here. It's a 90-acre field with a lot of variability. So we've got irrigated sands, and we've got a low area of the field that's high organic matter. It's 8 to 10% organic matter, but it's kind of a muck soil. It's got a very sandy, coarse texture to it, and it's high organic matter. So again, looking at our broadcast first banding programs, every year we can always see where the banded programs are. The plants are larger, healthier, and growing a little more vigorously. Look at the soil test values. This was a high soil test value field when we started. This farmer invests in fertilizer and always has. So we're at 38 part per million on phosphorus. We're actually above the optimum range, 231 on the potassium, above the range there, and his pH is right where it needs to be. So 3 years later, our banding program, we're just slowly pulling that phosphorus and potassium down just a hair in a more realistic range, maintaining the pH. And our broadcast program, we're essentially just maintaining it where the farmer had it when we started. So this is 2019 yield map. You can see the difference in zones. So we're going to look at the yield results by zone in this field. So irrigated sand hill at the top, a flat sandy loam area in the middle there. It's actually the highest yielding part of the farm. And then the irrigated sandy muck bottom. And to the right of that, we've got dry land bottom ground there. And then there's a zone that we separated because it always has struggle with holding water. There's a sand vein underneath that bottom right zone, so we are analyzing it separately as well. So we look at the cost savings. So the cost savings of the banded program compared to the broadcast by zone, it's anywhere from $14 up to $45 an acre, lower cost to do the banding with low build concept. So on average, we're $28 an acre for this field. Lower cost with the banding program. The average yield advantage of the banding program compared to the broadcast, we got anywhere from basically neutral in some zones to 11 and 13 bushel an acre advantages in other zones. Some of those in the irrigated sands and the dryland mucks are making a big difference. So 7.6 bushel advantage for the whole field. So the profit advantage of the banding program over the broadcast, we're averaging $55 an acre higher profit. So this is an average of the 3 years that we've been doing this. And so you can see that there is an opportunity there to be more efficient with ROI on our programs. So here's all 3 fields as a recap. So we've got low fertilizer soil test values, we've got high fertilizer soil test values, we've got high productive soils, low productive soils under irrigation, and they all showed that we can increase profits by changing how we manage the farm. These tubes here are averaging all of that data together, and so the height of this fertilizer cylinder, we'll call this group of cylinders here the status quo of how we're managing P and K in our fertilizer system. This is to scale by pounds of nutrients of K and phosphorus. And then this is representative of the yield on average that we're getting. This program over here then we'll call it the optimized program that we should be working towards in the future, where we're blending together some banded nutrients with the broadcast, adjusting our soil build target and the yield advantage that goes with that. So far, those 3 fields averaged over 3 years. Our corn crop is averaging a 5 bushel advantage, 5.5 bushel advantage. and our net profit increase is $61 an acre on average for those 3 farms. So again, this is intended to be exposing what we're learning and what we're looking at, and hopefully you take home some opportunities to change some things. One thing I want to note is, how did we get this done? Equipment-wise, did we change anything on the farm? We actually confined ourselves to only use equipment passes that are already standard running over the field. So the same equipment passes that were already in place is what we implemented. So the only difference between status quo and optimum is that we added fertilizer on the planter. We put starter nitrogen on the planter as opposed to not having that, and adjusting how we address our fertilizer soil test values as well. So it's a combination of how we apply, but also the overall recommendation and soil sampling program. So to recap here as I finish up, we should improve soil sampling accuracy by using smart zones instead of grids. The interpolation between points is the problem with accuracy there. Increase sampling frequency to every 2 years, like about 10% of our audience has already moved to. Lower soil test build targets if you're banning fertilizer. You've got to get your fertilizer agronomist involved if you're going to start banding with starter on the planter. So it seems like across all of our trials over the last 5-6 years, an optimum range to be in is about 1/4 of your nitrogen program applied with the planter in the spring, and about 1/3 of your phosphorus program applied with the planter seems to be a pretty good range to be in. Maximizing in-season banding, especially with your nitrogen program, you need to be side dressing and putting the bulk of the nitrogen in season. We were doing that with all programs, but just as a general rule of thumb, that's a huge opportunity on all farms. And then side dress bar can be a place to carry some of the volume of P and K if you want to have higher rates of banding but don't want to carry it all on the planter. You could split the difference there a little bit. That's still a good band of nutrients that'll be available as the crop gets a little bit taller. So just a thought. I don't have a lot of data on that, but just passing that along as something to think about. So that concludes our session, and I got the signals that lunch is next, and we're out of time. So thank you guys at the simulcast locations. Hopefully you got something to take home, and we'll see where this goes. I hope to keep these programs going for a long time. Before you guys